everybody. Welcome back to the Work Training Center Sportscast. On this episode, we are going to continue the discussion on the NFL draft. So on the last episode, we covered the basics, and on this episode, I'm going to cover the history of the NFL draft. If you have not seen my last video, it might be a good idea to watch that first. So if you haven't already liked the Work Training Center Facebook page, go ahead and go to Facebook and type in Work Training Center on the search bar and click on their page and scroll down until you find the first NFL draft video. And while you do, go ahead and go to the YouTube link and go on there and like our channel on YouTube. And that will give you access to all of our other videos. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my PowerPoint. So I organized all the history based on decades. So it started from the 1920s all the way up into the 2010s. So the early days. This refers to the time before the NFL draft. So the NFL started on August 20th, 1920, and from that season all the way to the 1935 season, there was no draft. Players got to pick which team they wanted to play for, and so they would usually just pick the team that paid more money and won more football games. So it was essentially just a free-for-all. In 1935, Bert Bell, who was the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles, proposed a college player draft. So like they do now, they picked in reverse order based on standing. So the worst teams will pick first, and the best teams will pick last, basically. The first NFL draft was in 1936, and it was 9 rounds. The first player to be drafted was Joey Berwanger. He never actually played in the NFL. Instead, he elected to work at a rubber factory, I believe. At the time, football players didn't get paid a whole lot, so there was other career choices that would probably pay a little bit better and maybe even be a little less dangerous than football was when it started. In 1939, the draft was expanded to 20 rounds. So in the 1940s, the All-American Football Conference formed. They were a rival to the NFL, and the NFL and the All-American Football Conference did not play each other. They were completely separate leagues, but both leagues were picking from the same college players. So a lot of the time, the NFL might pick one of the teams in the NFL would pick a player, and then the AFC would go and they would pick that same player, and then they would have to battle it out which team actually received the player, and it would usually end up the player would go to the team that would pay more money. This was just, it created too much conflict for both of the leagues, and it really just wasn't beneficial to either one of them. But I'll set the AFC to the side, and I will get back to it a little bit later. So in the 1943 draft, the NFL expanded it to 30 rounds. This is because of World War II and the fact that teams were drafting players that would also get drafted into the war. And the war was more important than football, so those players obviously had to go fight in the war instead of play football. In the 1947 draft, the NFL added a bonus pick. The bonus pick was the first overall pick. If you remember from the first episode, the first overall pick is the very first pick in the draft. So the way they decided who got this bonus pick was through a lottery. So each team could win this lottery one time, and after they win the one time, they're taken out of the drawing. And once every single team had won the bonus pick, they discontinued it. And that was in 1958 when they discontinued it. So into the 1960s. So tension between the AFC and the NFL grew. They kept on picking players that the rival league would end up picking, and it just really was not working out. And that's because they held separate drafts. So it was a constant battle which draft would be before the other. And obviously the one that was the draft before the other draft is going to get first pick on the college players coming out of the draft. This came to an end, though, in the 1966 season. They decided to have a joint draft. So that means they both had one big draft where both of the leagues picked. And this took away the conflict of both leagues picking one player that the other one had already picked. But these leagues did not play each other still. So they were still completely separate. They just had the same draft. And this continued from 1967 to 1969. But in 1970, the two leagues merged. So it formed the AFC and the NFC. And you still see that today. So and instead of fighting over players, they now started fighting over the Super Bowl. So there's always an AFC team and an NFC team. So in combination between the two leagues, there was now 26 teams in the NFL. And they've reduced the draft to 12 rounds instead of 30 rounds. And the first overall pick in the first draft where the two leagues have merged was Terry Bradshaw. A pretty significant pick because he went on to win 4 Super Bowls with the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you don't know him as a football player, you have probably seen him on Fox Sports, or he's also had a few acting gigs as well. So on to the 1980s. So there was another rival that came into play, and this was the United States Football League. They only played 3 seasons, so they did not last nearly as long as the All-American Football Conference. And they played those seasons from 1983 to 1985. And so, again, the problem with another league picking players that the other league was picking from. And this caused a competition because the United States Football League noticed that there was no football in the springtime. So that's when they had their season. And so they tended to have a draft before the NFL. And so that was causing a conflict between the two. When the United States Football League decided to move their season to the fall time to compete with the NFL is when there was a lot of issues. This is kind of when the United States Football League realized they didn't stand a chance against the NFL. They didn't have the level of talent, and they didn't really have the competition that the NFL was building. So they ended up filing an antitrust lawsuit against the NFL. This was heavily supported by Donald Trump, owner of the New Jersey Generals, and he's now currently our president. They aimed to sue the NFL and then merge like the AFC did. However, this did not work. The United States Football League did win the suit, but it was only in name. They only actually got $3 out of the lawsuit. And in the end, the United States Football League lost $163 million. So I'm going to keep on the 1980s. So the 1980s was a big shift in the NFL. This is where the big quarterback kind of came into play. Most people, like the players that you can name off the top of your head, they tend to be quarterbacks. They tend to be Joe Montana, John Elway, Dan Marino, those kind of guys. Most of those household names came into play in the late 70s or the 1980s. And then there's been some that came in the 2000s. So in 1983, it was a pretty crazy draft because in the first round, 3 Hall of Fame quarterbacks were picked. The first overall pick was John Elway. The 14th overall was Jim Kelly. And the 27th overall was Dan Marino. Callie, you want to get down? And then some other quarterbacks that were drafted in the 1980s were Randall Cunningham, Troy Aikman, Steve Young, and Boomer Esiason. And there's quite a few Hall of Famers and guys that should be Hall of Famers in that list. Both Troy Aikman and Steve Young are in the Hall of Fame. So on to the 1990s. So the 1990s provided a great display of a team drafting their way to success. And it was the Dallas Cowboys that showed this. So in 1989, the Dallas Cowboys had a record of 1-15. But throughout the 1990s, the Cowboys actually won 3 Super Bowls. And this was all through a draft strategy that is still used today by other teams. Another example of a team that built through the draft and also through free agency as well was the San Francisco 49ers. In 1994, the draft was reduced to 7 rounds, and it has stayed that way since. And that is pretty much how they drafted in 1994 is very similar to how they draft now. So on to the 2000s. So there was a new philosophy. Teams started trading away picks. This still happened in the past, but now it was happening more frequently. There were teams that wanted to acquire more picks, and there were teams that didn't place as much importance on them and wanted free agents or players that are already in the league. There was also a lot of teams that were trading up in the draft. So in the 2000 draft, Tom Brady was drafted in the 6th round, and he was a great example of a guy who wasn't held very highly amongst the league. As you can see in this picture right here, he doesn't look the most athletic, but he's turned out to be one of the best quarterbacks of all time. So you never really know who's going to turn out. There's some guys in the 1st round that are awful in their career, and there's others that are in the later rounds that end up being Hall of Famers or potential Hall of Famers. He has gone on to win 5 Super Bowls with the Patriots, and maybe 1 with the Buccaneers. Hopefully not. So this will cover the 2010s and then 2020. So this decade marked another change in philosophy. Teams started to pass the ball more often and place less importance on the running game. So you see a lot less running backs being drafted in the 1st round or even in the early rounds. This is where you see there's definitely some household names in the running back world, but a lot of running backs only last a couple years, and then teams are looking for the next guy to replace them. Like there's not a whole lot of Frank Gores anymore that go on to play 10 plus seasons and still run really well. So now teams are looking at really good, solid quarterbacks. They're looking for a Tom Brady. They're looking for a Peyton Manning or somebody like that. And you don't always find those guys in the 1st round. There's a lot of great quarterbacks that are not 1st round quarterbacks, like Russell Wilson, for example. But nevertheless, these teams still do that anyways. So from 2010 to 2020, 8 out of the 11 first overall picks were quarterbacks. So the worst team is generally lacking in a good quarterback. So that's what they're looking to kind of fill the void in their talent. So some of these guys that you guys might know are Cam Newton, Jared Goff, Andrew Luck, and Jameis Winston. 3 out of those 4 guys are still in the league, but Andrew Luck decided to retire, and Jameis Winston is looking at being a bench guy, and Cam Newton isn't signed to a team currently. So it shows that a lot of these guys don't actually even work out. In the 2010s, we have still learned, as we've learned all throughout the NFL history, there are a lot of amazing quarterbacks in the later rounds. So like I had mentioned, Russell Wilson, Jimmy G, Kirk Cousins, Dak Prescott, Nick Foles, 3 of which have gone on to play in Super Bowls. And most of them, I don't think Dak Prescott has played in the playoffs. So most of them have actually played in the playoffs. So here's just some interesting stuff that I found as I was researching for this video. In the last episode, I covered the time limit of the NFL draft, but there actually used to be no time limit. In one example, a Cowboys GM heard of an injury history with a player who was named Mel Renfro. So he called a doctor and made him evaluate the quarterback. So the pick ended up taking 6 hours. You can't do that now. And luckily, there is a combine where players can meet with team doctors and get evaluated. So that has kind of fixed that issue. But there was a few instances of that happening. But no, you cannot do that now. Thank goodness. And another interesting fact is the Green Bay Packers passed on both Joe Montana and Ronnie Lott. They picked two other guys that I can't remember, but they didn't really turn out to be all that great. So they passed on two Hall of Famers. In 1946, the Los Angeles Rams owner John Reeves hired a guy to read newspapers and find him the best players. That idea and that concept turned into the NFL scout. And so the first NFL scout was actually Eddie Codell. At one point, the Redskins tried to draft Cal Rossi in 1946, but he wasn't actually eligible for the draft. He was only a junior in college, and you have to be a graduating senior to get drafted. Or not graduating, but you have to be a senior. So they tried to draft Rossi the next year, but he decided that he didn't want to play football. So they missed out on him twice and wasted 2 picks. They didn't get a chance to pick anybody else. And some extra interesting stuff. In 1980, the NFL draft was aired on TV for the first time. It was broadcasted by a startup named ESPN. I'm sure you have heard of them by now. At that time, it was only aired to 4 million people, but now it is broadcasted to over 200 million people. And this brought the emergence of the mock draft, the stuff that keeps football fans busy during the offseason. So a mock draft is just anybody can make one. It's just basically a list of who you think teams are going to pick in the draft. And ESPN, NFL Network, Barstool Sports, Bleacher Report, all of these guys, they're putting out mock drafts all the time. And it's kind of fun to read. It's kind of interesting to see what other people think your team might pick. And you can always make your own. They're fun to make. And you get to learn about all the college players in the process. But that is it for this episode of the Work Training Center Sportscast. I'm working on the next episode. I'll keep it a surprise for now, but it won't be about football. I promise. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.